A year or so back, Enoch Powell was kicked out of the shadow cabinet by Conservative leader Edward Heath in punishment for a speech in which Mr. Powell advocated an end to colored immigration into England and a policy of paying money to such recent immigrants as desired to leave England. It was generally assumed that now finally Mr. Powell had gone too far, but on the way to political extinction, a funny thing happened, namely the overwhelming support of the British people and a surprising support from the colored minority. It was, to begin with, a strange issue for Mr. Powell to get into. His principal concern has been in the area of economics, in which he is an unabashed believer in capitalism. I should say his principal political concern, because he is by training a professor of classics, a graduate of Cambridge and the youngest full professor ever to receive a chair at the University of Sydney. He enrolled as a private in the war against Hitler, and after the war was over, turned to politics, even though he continued to write learned books, among them a lexicon to Herodotus, and last year, his 600-page history of the House of Lords in the Middle Ages. He served as Minister of Health under Macmillan and occupied in the shadow cabinet the role of Minister of Defense. He is believed by many Englishmen to occupy a position in contemporary politics which is roughly comparable to Churchill's during the 30s and de Gaulle's during the 40s. Their prediction is that he will be called to serve as Prime Minister after the next, or perhaps next but one, national crisis. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Powell to explain to us what are the limits to party disobedience in England and who sets them?
I think it depends whether you're on the back bench or on the front bench. Obviously, if you're actually in a cabinet, you're governed by the rule of collective responsibility. And to a certain extent, this applies to the leadership of a party in opposition, where I'm afraid we have in recent years got into a rather solemn habit of treating the ex-ministers who sit on our front bench as, you used the phrase, I'm not blaming you, a shadow cabinet. Well, of course it isn't a cabinet. It's a shadow, all right, but it's not a cabinet. Indeed, that isn't its technical name. Its technical name is simply the Leaders' Consultative Committee. And in theory, they're just the people whom he asks particularly to advise him. But obviously, they will require to maintain a closer cohesion than is either necessary or desirable for the bulk of party members of Parliament. And again, if I could add just one point, clearly in opposition, a greater width of variation is not only permissible, but is useful, because there's a kind of scouting process that is going on in opposition than would be possible when one is supporting a government. I don't know if I've answered your question.
You have splendidly. I'd like to know this, however, simply as a matter of mechanical curiosity. It was easy enough for Mr. Heath to oust you from the front bench, as I understand it, but it would not be easy for him to oust you from the back bench. Does he, in fact, have such control of the party machinery that they could deny you the backing of the Conservative Party next time you stood?
Well, in theory, the party can, as we say, withdraw the whip. I believe I'm right in saying that in contrast to the Labour Party, the Conservative Party has never withdrawn the whip from anyone elected as a Conservative member. There have been cases where Conservative members have refused the whip of their own accord, but of course that's quite different. If one stood oneself as an independent, then clearly the party might well run an official candidate. But that isn't in question. And therefore, for practical purposes, the answer to your question is no.
So therefore, in effect, any heterodoxy is possible for you. Now, have you committed the maximum heterodoxy? That is to say, is there anybody in the House of Parliament who sides with you on this last position that you took respecting the problems of uncontrolled immigration?
Oh, surely. And I'm not so sure about the doxy part of your question. You know, when Mr. Heath said he didn't want me any longer, what he took exception to was not the policy of what I said, but, in his own word, the tone. And on the 2 points which you very accurately mentioned in your introduction of me, they are both, to a certain extent, part of the official policy of the party. It is the official policy of the party to cut down the rate of immigration. I won't go into the details of how. There was, a matter of fact, unconsciously further in saying I believed it should be virtually terminated. I thought at that time that that was, in fact, our official policy. And as regards assistance to repatriation, that is an official part of the policy of the Tory party, has been for 3-4 years, and it is only the expected scope which I attach to it. I believe it is of great practical importance. It is only there that any divergence exists. So it's very difficult to say that here is a big split on policy. If you ask me to find splits on policy, I would find them more easily in other subjects.
Well, then what about the Labour Party, though? We know that the Labour Party passed as recently as, a year or so ago, measures that were restrictive of immigration and were ethnically oriented, sort of the equivalence of our Oriental Exclusion Act, isn't that correct?
Well, I think that would want to be heavily qualified. You're thinking about the act of last year,
yes, sir,
which was made necessary by the inflow of Indians from Kenya. Now, this act stopped up a loophole in the 1962 Act, the first act by which we controlled Commonwealth immigration at all.
And 62 was what? That was conservative, wasn't it?
That was conservative. And that was the first time that we had any control whatsoever.
Opposed by Labour or backed by Labour?
That was opposed by Labour, bitterly opposed by Labour throughout, line by line, as they said. And this loophole had been, as it turned out, unintentionally left, was being utilised by the Asians in Kenya, though in fact it could have been used by Chinese in Malaya and by literally millions of other persons who happened to be in this special situation and had to be closed. That's what happened last year. But that's not a very big numerical importance.
Would you say that at the present moment, the same party that opposed the 1962 Act would back it?
Yes, what they do.
It follows from its failure to repeal it.
Indeed, they administer it. And very recently, the Home Secretary has introduced further measures which will tend to prevent various kinds of evasion. So upon the whole, the administration and the legislation is gradually more restrictive.
Now, as I understand it then, the immigration laws in England which are backed by the Labour Party and by your party are laws that would exclude certain people on the basis of their race.
No.
That is incorrect.
That's incorrect.
Well, would you state it correctly? What is it that you do exclude?
Yes, indeed. May I, will you give me a few sentences to sketch in the history?
Yes, sir.
Because this is something quite peculiar to Britain. And unless one understands the British legal background, one gets it all wrong. Because alone of all countries in the world, until 1962, we had no definition of ourselves. You have a definition of a United Kingdom citizen.
United States.
United States citizen, I'm sorry. We had no definition of a person belonging to the United Kingdom. We had no definition of a Briton. There was a definition of a British subject, but that was a person who was a subject of the king or queen. And so as the British Empire extended, that definition included hundreds of millions of people wherever the sun had not set on the British Empire. So there literally was no difference in the law of Britain between myself coming back from a day's trip to France and an Indian from the northwest frontier entering Britain by air for the first time. The law could not see the difference between any of these 800 or 900 millions of people. Now, in 1962, for the first time, we introduced, though backhandedly as we generally do these things, we introduced a definition of those who belong to the United Kingdom so that we could control the entry of those who don't. But under that act, we control the entry of Australians just as strictly and on just the same principles as we control the entry of Indians or West Indians.
Is this a formalistic observation or in fact?
No, this in fact happens, and you get tremendous complaints from Australians who say, why, when we come home, as they call it, are we treated as foreigners?
Well, but you have been quoted as casting considerable doubt on the possibility of integrating, quotes, races of totally disparate origins and cultures. In fact, you've been quoted as saying that such integration is one of the great myths of our time. It has never worked throughout history. You went on to say in this particular article published in the New York Times, and quoting you, the U.S. lost its only real opportunity of solving its racial problem when it failed after the Civil War to partition the old Confederacy into a South Africa and a Liberia.
I have an idea, if I may interpolate, that this is not a verbatim, but is a report of a conversation with me.
Yes, sir.
However, I'm therefore emphasizing that the words are not mine, but certainly I recognize the discussion.
There's a certain inelegance in the formulation to which you're objecting.
Thank you.
we will grant that. The reason I ask this is because I think a lot of people, you know, want to hear you level on the subject. Is it that you want to keep out of England, and by you I mean not only you but apparently the government, people who are not easily assimilated because of disparate backgrounds, and you feel the necessity to erect an abstract barrier which is theoretically colorblind, but in fact would you welcome Canadians or Americans who wanted to immigrate into England while discouraging Pakistani?
Well, in practice, there isn't any white Commonwealth net immigration into the United Kingdom because they don't want to come. As a matter of fact, in recent years, there's been a net emigration from the United Kingdom of Australians, Canadians, and New Zealanders. Therefore, in that sense, the question is theoretical. But again, I can assure you that both the law itself and the way in which it is administered does not discriminate between Commonwealth citizens who are white and those who are coloured. Now, to answer your question, I would put it the other way around. I would say there is a limit to the number of, and I'm going to use this word in an entirely neutral sense, aliens who can be brought into a nation, particularly as close-knit and concentrated a nation as Britain is, without breaking the bounds of that society and setting up intolerable frictions and stresses as damaging to one side as to the other. Now, this is a question of number, but the relationship between number and difference is clearly important, because the more different they are, and colour is a signal, an outward signal of difference. It's not significant itself, but it signalises other differences that one can't deny. The greater the difference, the smaller the numbers that can at any one time
be assimilated,
accepted without breaking or being thought to break, which comes to the same thing, for we're talking about psychology, the framework of a nation and of a society. So it's numbers.
Well, would you explain to me under the circumstances why it is that almost all of the opinion makers in England, and even the leader of your own party, were so horrified at your expressing what you are now in effect telling us is the codified principle in England, namely control over immigration, even such control as might be used to terminate immigration, and a recognition that alien cultures are more difficult to assimilate than congruent cultures?
Yes, I don't think that the anxiety arose over that. One must remember, incidentally, that the context of my speech just over a year ago was an act introduced by the Labour government against racial discrimination, an act which the Conservative Party officially was opposing. And indeed, I made that speech on the eve of the second reading, supporting the party's decision to oppose that bill. And one of the reasons why we opposed it on the ground that it would do more harm than good. Namely, that in the areas of large concentration of immigrants, the effect of it, the practical effect, would be that the local inhabitants would feel that they were the people who were being discriminated against. Now, that's a not unimportant background, because even if today all immigration whatsoever were ended, bang, from today, we would still be faced with a rate of expansion of the immigrant population and their children concentrated in certain areas, which there is a great anxiety not to admit. And one understands this. First of all, if you belong, as all politicians do, in England to parties who've allowed this to happen. There's a strong premium on not admitting the full weight of the consequences.
But doesn't one suppose that as this population increases, the processes of acculturation go forward, so that after the passage of a generation, you're simply dealing with Englishmen with a black skin rather than with Pakistani?
Well, actually not. In fact, as the numbers increase, the tendency is for separation to increase. Let me give you a fact which will illustrate that. In Birmingham, which is near my own constituency of Wolverhampton, in Birmingham, which is a city of over 1 million, the proportion of coloured births 2 years ago, that's the latest figures, was 20%, 1 in 5. And it had risen from 5% to 20% over the previous decade. Now, of those coloured births, 10 years ago, a quarter were mixed. At the last available...
You're talking about racially mixed?
Racially mixed, yes. One parent white, one parent coloured. Last year, or rather the year before, only 1/8. So that as the numbers increased, the degree of intermarriage and assimilation was diminishing.
When I said acculturation, I didn't mean miscegenation. My point is, doesn't one suppose that the passage of a generation spent in Birmingham produces Englishmen?
Not if it is spent in areas which are totally occupied by people of one's own culture, language, and we must remember that we are now primarily talking of East Indians.
Well, do they go to schools that teach English?
Well, there are increasingly pressures for them to be taught in Punjabi or Hindustani. And even if they learn English at school, they return, and the girls return to Purdah after they leave school. The Pakistani girls in Bradford return to Purdah after leaving school. So that as the numbers almost explosively increase in this generation, you do in fact get a pulling apart. Whereas if there were 1 in 100 or 2 in 100, then this cultural assimilation, whether accompanied by a miscegenation or not, against which I've got no prejudice, would take place. The larger the numbers, the higher the concentrated proportion, the less in fact it does or is likely to happen.